You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. I'm Jill Waterman, the show's creative producer. I'm also host of our new monthly series, Picturing World Cultures. Tree planting springs from a heritage of nation building and lumberjacks. In recent years, it's become a rite of passage for young Canadians not afraid of hard work and dirt under their fingernails. Equal parts industrial labor and high-intensity sport, an average tree planter can burn 8,000 calories, roughly the equivalent of running 2.5 marathons a day. Working in the land for months on end and sharing an isolated campsite creates a solid bond among planters. This has molded into a subculture of sorts, which is the subject of today's show. My guest for this episode is Canadian photographer and filmmaker Rita Leistner. Rita documents communities living in extreme conditions, typically investing months or years in a project. After spending a decade as a tree planter during her youth, Rita returned to the forest in 2016 to document a new generation. In 2021, she released her results as an art trifecta, featuring large fine art photographs, a 256-page photo book, and the documentary feature film Forest for the Trees. Equally in her element in forest and war zones, Rita's photographs and her writings about photography, art, and war have been published, exhibited, and collected worldwide. She is represented by the Stephen Bulger Gallery for Art and by Green Planet Films for film. Rita Leistner, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jill.
Yeah, it's great to speak with you today. So the job of tree planting seems to be a rite of passage for young Canadians. Can you give us a brief backstory about Canadian tree planting as a business? How long has it been around?
So tree planting is pretty young, this kind of industrial mass quantity tree planting. It's only begins in really the late 70s as a response to the environmental movement, but more specifically to the mechanization of logging, which the environmental movement was actually responding to. Because believe it or not, up until the 60s, logging is still being done with horses.
Wow.
It's pretty hard to imagine how much has changed since then. So when the major mechanization comes in, suddenly way more trees are being cut. And of course, consumption is increasing to meet that, right? It always goes back to consumption and demand. So suddenly there's this need to plant more trees. Up until then, logging companies and loggers, for the most part, had been doing the planting. Also, prisoners were sent to plant trees. Indigenous people were sent to plant trees. Women did some tree planting. It really was the lowest job in the forest, the most brutal physically, and the lowest job in terms of status. So here's this vacuum, this possibility of more work. And a group of young people from Western Canada and the United States, many of whom had mountaineering experience, many of whom were skiers, so they were super strong people who were accustomed to working on the land with their bodies. And they had this genius idea, really, of approaching tree planting as a sport. And out of the blue, they come and they start bidding on these contracts, and with crazy kinds of quota numbers saying, well, we can plant 10 times more trees than the loggers are planting. And no one believed it until they did it, which is why I call it a hybrid between industrial labor and high-intensity sport. So this is really the birth of mass production tree planting.
Right. Just picture big, burly loggers trying to run through the forest planting trees.
Yeah, and also just the status, because, back in the early days of logging, which is the same thing as the early days of North American colonization. I mean, the British and the French come to North America to log, basically, because they've run out of big trees in Europe for their warships. So logging in North America is as old as colonization. So it's been around forever. And it was synonymous with nation building, with all these like romantic ideas of what it was to establish the colonies, really. I mean, ideas that we view differently now, but still there was a romanticism attached to it. Whereas, tree planting didn't have that. And we still live in a culture where, machoism and killing is glamorized, and, planting trees and giving birth is not seen as important.
So you spent a decade working as a tree planter from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. Did you make any pictures during that time, or did you come to photography after that point?
So I wanted to be a photographer before then. Really, from about the age of 15, I was always a very visual person. I was always very moved by light, by composition. The visual world excited me, and photography excited me, but I had no idea how I could possibly become a photographer. In fact, I had unsuccessfully applied to photography schools, really, because I didn't even know the process. There was no internet, like I walked up to Ryerson University when I was 18 to the administration office and said, I want to study photography. And they're like, well, you need a portfolio. Like, I didn't know anything. I eventually got into the University of Toronto part-time studying literature, which I ended up falling in love with. I stayed for 6 years. I did a master's degree in literary theory. But during that time, I needed to find a job to make extra money. And as a young woman, the only kinds of jobs I could get in Toronto were like working as a hostess. I remember applying for jobs where they said, well, but you're going to have to wear makeup and pantyhose. And I was like, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then I was fortunate enough to learn about tree planting, because it's still a world that if you don't really know about it, you wouldn't even know to apply for the job. And back then, my sister was varsity ski racing in Ontario, and someone on her varsity team planted trees. So she went planting for a year, and she's 4 years older than me. And through her, I was able to get a job. There were very few women planting in those days. And my first tree planting crew was me and 12 guys. And I remember our first shift was 4 weeks in the mountains of British Columbia without a day off. And we had no access to clean water. And we ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches only, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for
Oh
a
my
month.
God.
And, didn't have shelter, didn't have anything for cooking. We were getting sick from the water, so we put bleach in the water so that it would kill off the Giardia bacteria. So I got that job, and I still liked it a lot better than the prospect of being a hostess. And I also really like that you're paid for piecework, which means you get paid per tree for the work you do.
Right.
And in a society where even when I did succeed at things, people would say, oh, well, you were given a chance because you're a girl, or somehow you were belittled in some way. And with tree planting, if you planted 1,000 trees, no one could take that away from you. And I really like that. I like that idea of being valued for what I did. And actually, photography is kind of like that too. Like, you can talk and talk and talk, but until you produce the images, that's really the proof of what you've done. So being a freelance artist is similar in that way.
Right.
So I couldn't take photographs in the bush because it was so dirty. Like, I remember I did have a little point shoot camera, but it was filthy. And eventually, a few years in, I heard about a Canadian photographer named Lorraine Gilbert. She was a tree planter. She's probably 10 years older than me. And she was producing these incredible portraits of tree planters, sort of in an Avedon style. She was working in the bush, but bringing a muslin backdrop with her and photographing the tree planters against the muslin backdrops, which was something that Avedon was becoming well known for. And she set up one tent for her gear and one tent for herself to sleep in. I was like, well, how did she do that? So I started following Lorraine Gilbert. So she continues to be an influence, but back then that was really highly, highly inspiring to me.
That's cool. Did you ever meet her?
As it happened, before making my tree planting project, but after planting trees, I became a documentary photographer, and I worked a lot in war zones. And eventually I was invited to give lectures across Canada. I was giving a lecture in Ottawa the nation's capital, where Lorraine happens to live, but I didn't know that. And I was giving a talk about influences on my war work. And even then, I brought up Lorraine Gilbert and I showed some of her pictures during the presentation. And after she came up to me and said, "I'm Lorraine Gilbert," like,
Wow.
yeah, and we've remained friends ever since.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Great way to meet your hero.
Right? Yeah.
But she never photographed you as a planter.
No, well, because she was part of the first generation of tree planters, and I was at the tail end of that generation. So by the time I'm planting trees, she's retired from tree planting, and her pictures are starting to come out. So that's why I would have seen her pictures, but she had since retired. But it inspired me and made me sort of see that it was possible. But I was still really into literary studies at the time. I kind of put photography to the side for a while. And it wasn't until I got my MA and was thinking about doing a PhD. I mean, so much so that I had applied and had been offered scholarships. And I took time off and I bought like a little Volkswagen Rabbit for $700 and spent like 10 months driving around North America and Mexico making photographs in black and white on just a little like Nikon camera. And this trip was just amazing. And I realized that I didn't want to spend my life in an institution. I knew that if I was going to be a university professor, I'd have to spend an awful lot of my life in a library and in an office writing and reading. And as much as I loved those things, I loved better being out in the world, engaging with people and using a camera as a way of enhancing that engagement. And I came back to Toronto and I had a little exhibition. And I decided that that was it. I had sort of lost my dream of being a photographer, but I wanted it back. And I turned down, this amazing scholarship and kind of started at the bottom, but not because I had all these other skills to bring to it. I got a job in the film industry working as a production assistant, hoping to get into the lighting departments because I thought, well, what is photography if not lighting? And I needed a job. And so then I started working in the film industry, in the lighting departments. Once again, part of a tiny minority of women. I mean, I think there were 5 women in the entire country working in the lighting and electrical departments at that time. And that's a big part of where the lighting influence in my work comes from.
Right. Yeah. All those technical aspects are really important.
Yeah.
So to go back to the tree planting and the transition from you as a planter to you deciding many years later to go back and photograph this new generation, what kind of differences did you find to the environment and the people? Was it more structured and it had grown up in terms of the business of tree planting?
It was definitely more structured. I didn't ask a lot of questions before I went back because I knew I was going to do it and I almost didn't want to know. Like I didn't ask questions like how many days do you work without a day off, things like that. Because, my first shift, I'd work 21 days without a day off and it was a nightmare. And by the time I started this project, I was 50 and I thought, oh my God, like, is my body going to be able to handle this? I was actually really afraid of the physical side of it. And when we got out there, I realized they did 3 days on and 1 day off. And I was so relieved because at the end of 3 days, I was physically destroyed and I needed that time off as a photographer, even of tree planting.
Right.
And, the industry realized that production is actually higher if you give people breaks. So they didn't do it out of sheer kindness. It was from a perspective of productivity, which of course is important to the planters too, because they're being paid per tree. And so the 3 days that they're out there working, they can work at full tilt. And the whole operation that supports it, the vehicles, the fuel, keeping the camp going, the cooking and all of that. If you have all that money going into it and production is low, the company is not doing as well either. So it works out better for everybody. And tree planting as a business, it's not very lucrative. Like it kind of had a heyday, but now it's a real struggle. And everyone I know with a tree planting company is barely making ends meet. I mean, The competition is really stiff. There are fewer and fewer logging companies as they amalgamate. So there's no competition among the logging companies who the tree planting companies bid for contracts with. So
Oh,
you're all up against each other trying to keep the prices low, but you have to play your planters well enough or they're not going to want to do it.
yeah, the margins must be really shrinking.
So they have showers in camp, which we didn't have. They have cooks. Like I also had gone weeks without bathing,
Right.
things that prepared me very well for working in a war zone, by the way. When I lived in the desert for 2 months with the American cavalry, going 21 days without a shower was no big deal for me. And tree planting had kind of taught me, tricks of hygiene that you learn too, like how, you don't need to wash your hair, for instance,
Right.
like that's not a priority. So cleaner, better hours.
Was there lodging or does everybody have to bring their own lodging?
Most people sleep in tents and some have camper trailers. Some contracts are close enough to maybe motels, but very rarely. You call it a motel show. And that would be if your planting site is maybe an hour or two from a motel. But more often than not, you're driving 2, 3 hours into the bush just to get to
Right.
where the work is happening. So you have to sleep out there. You have to be mobile
Mhm.
and you sleep in a tent or you have a mobile trailer. The camps have generators. So that's how they have hot water and power.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not running all the time. Cold is a big problem because you're up in the mountains. So even in summer, it drops below freezing. The
Yeah.
cold is terrible, especially April, May, June. I can't remember a June it didn't snow.
Wow. Wow, they start planting as early as April.
Yeah,
Oof.
as soon as the ground thaws.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so it depends on where you are in the country. You kind of start on the West Coast where it's more temperate, and then
Right.
you move east with the weather. I mean, it's very affected by the weather and the seasons.
Yeah.
But like the thing that hadn't changed was how it was done. Their shovels were a little bit shorter and more ergonomic. Like they had tweaked things.
Mhm.
Their clothing, they're wearing like high tech fabrics, and where we wore like army pants and army boots, and now they had more high tech clothing that
Mhm.
enabled them to move faster. But because it had never been mechanized, the physicality of it was the same. And that was really essential to me because I wanted to show the physicality of this work. I'd never met anyone other than tree planters who had any idea what this work was like or how hard it was. And in fact, when I was working in war zones and people would ask me what prepared me for that work, I would say tree planting in Canada. And people were very surprised
Mhm.
because they would say tree planting didn't sound very hard. And I thought, oh my God, like even today with all the very difficult things I've done in my life, tree planting is still certainly physically the absolute hardest thing I've ever done.
Right.
And so I thought I would like to go back and really, really show that side of it, like show more sides of it, but really show the physicality.
Can you describe a typical day that the tree planters would have and the actual planting process?
So tree planting has never been mechanized. It's done by hand and shovel. And that's a real beauty of it. The shovel is sort of part of you, and you've got giant bags full of trees around your waist, and you walk into the land with your trees and your shovel, and you start planting one at a time. The bags themselves weigh anywhere between, say, 30 to 40 pounds, depending on how big you are.
Mm.
If you're me, probably you wouldn't bag up more than 30 pounds because you need to be able to walk with some kind of agility.
And how many trees would that be?
That would be like maybe a couple of hundred seedlings.
Mm.
Very roughly 2,000 trees a day is a solid number of trees to plant if you want to break minimum wage.
Okay. So that would be
$200 a day
uh-huh.
for a 10-hour day.
Mm.
So now, because there's a union and it's good, when you leave camp and you get back to camp, it can't be more than 12 hours.
Mm.
So if it takes you an hour to get to your planting site, then you plant for 10 hours and then you're back at 7, basically.
Mm.
You leave at 7 a.m. and you're back at 7 p.m. And in between then you need to eat and maybe bathe, but some don't, and sleep. And sleep is the big thing because you're unbelievably tired.
Right.
And then days off are very social because also young people with huge amounts of energy. Yeah, up early, rain or shine, doesn't matter how cold it is. So picture it's like maybe barely above freezing or 1 degree below freezing, but you know that it'll be warmer in half an hour, and you've been sleeping in a tent and you're exhausted and your hands and your feet are all cramped up because you've been slamming a shovel in the ground thousands of times a day. You're kind of beaten up and you're really tired, but you're at the same time, motivated to go because you have a goal. You want to make some money to do other things with your life. You're not alone. That's really important. There are other people doing it at the same time. You're not together. You might be like a couple of miles apart,
Right.
or more in the land. Like you don't see anybody else all day. So it is kind of just you against the land. But when you get back to camp, you're not going to be alone. And you have that knowledge that everybody else is working really, really hard. So there's a camp cook. So you get up, you shovel some food in your mouth, you make your packed lunch, you bring a giant jug of water, which your crew foreman will probably fill up for you in the middle of the day because you have to drink a lot of water. And you head out in like big 4x4 trucks. Now these days, everyone needs a seat belt. Everyone needs a seat. When I planted, we used to just sit on the back of a flatbed, bouncing up and down logging roads. It was unbelievably dangerous. It's not like that now. You get out to your site, your foreman drops you off. You start planning right away because time is money and you got a watch on. Everybody has a watch. And you plant your first bag and you keep going till the end of the day. You might have to change land in the middle of the day because maybe you fill your area and then your foreman would help you move. That's kind of dead time. So you want a nice big juicy piece of land you can be in all day. And you bring your raincoat, you bring clothes for whatever the weather is, but you have to be very, very focused. And the faster you work, the less likely you are going to be cold. And the truck comes to pick you up. And you go back to camp and you shovel down 4 times what most people eat in a day. Tree planters eat 2 to 4 times what most people eat. Oh, here's a good figure. They burn 8,000 calories a day on average.
Wow.
It's the metabolic equivalent, that is like calories burned, to running 2.5 marathons every day.
Yikes.
And I mean, again, it's not running 2.5 marathons. It's running less distance, but you're carrying 30 pounds a year. You're moving up and down, planting trees all day. They lose unbelievable amounts of weight. And I mean, I was only photographing them, but I had to like walk up mountains carrying like 30 to 40 pounds of gear on my back. My assistant's carrying the same. We got to have water.
And the tree planters, you mentioned that it's now unionized, so their work time is regulated, but also there's regulations about how they're planting, right?
Well, that was always the case. Yeah, of course, if you just could go in there and throw trees any which way, it would be easy and the trees wouldn't live. They are very carefully monitored for quality control, and that has always been the case. You have to come out at 95% quality or you have to go back and fix it.
Yikes.
Like the whole area. So you don't want to plant wrong because otherwise you're going to be replanting the whole thing at no pay. So those have to be good. And they're checked for distance to each other, whether they're planted in the right kind of land. They're looking for plantable spots. It has to be tight. It can't be leaning. Sometimes there are different regulations, like obstacle planting is really kooky. And that would be in an area where there might be a lot of wildlife, like large wildlife. So they don't want the seedling to get stepped on. So you have to plant near like a fallen log or a rock. But yeah, so quality is really, really important.
And how soon after the planters have planted the area does the check happen? Is it like the next day or?
Next day, maybe. If you're like a high production planter, say if you're someone who is putting in 2,000-3,000 or more trees in a day, the checkers are just covering ground, right? So they're moving in behind the planters. So it might even happen while you're still in your piece of land. You'll see a checker and then your heart starts racing.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God, I hope my trees are okay. Or you might even wander over and go, how are my trees looking? And then you have a foreman who's looking at that also. And like the first day that someone plants trees ever, and you're taught how to plant a tree, your first day You might be working harder than you ever have in your life, and you plant maybe 100 trees or maybe 200 trees, and you know you have to plant 2,000, and you actually believe it's impossible.
Yeah.
You can't believe that you'll learn how to do it. And you do, but then maybe you learn how to do it in one kind of land, and then you move a couple 100 kilometers or even closer, and you're in a totally different kind of land. And now you have to learn how to plant fast and good quality at the same time in that kind of land, because that's the magic, is fast, but also high quality. That's the trick, how to know how to do that. When we talk about what veteran planters really have on others is that breadth of knowledge of the land. I mean, where you put the tree, you call it the microsite.
Mm.
And I call these like veterans masters of microsites. They can go into almost any kind of land and be like, oh yeah, in this kind of terrain, this particular yellow moss always has soil under it. And their eyes are like, so that when they slam their shovel in the ground, there's soil right there and they can plant that. Whereas someone who doesn't know, you can hear them like tapping, looking for spots. And then a veteran comes in and they glance at the land and they go bang and they find a spot. And the rookie's like, oh my God, how did you do that? So veterans planted 100 trees and a rookie's still padding around looking for a spot.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And I mean, that's what people like about it. They like that challenge.
Your decision of how you were going to make these pictures was influenced by Lorraine's work?
So Lorraine's work and Avedon's work was how they could photograph in the 80s. You know, like Lorraine's work, which I admire so much because she was using a medium format camera, sure, a Hasselblad. And I wanted my photographs to be action photographs. I wanted to have action shots and I want to use flash at the same time because I had been thinking about classical painting and heroic painting, Caravaggio and Delacroix, and how could I portray these fast-moving subjects, because the tree planters are moving really fast in really rugged terrain. How could I capture them photographically the way that I might represent them in a painting? And to do that the way I wanted, I would need light to do that. And this was something I was able to do with the PhaseOne camera because I'm shooting all very high key. These are bright, sunny days. I want total depth of field. And this is, again, part of the painterliness, right? Because like depth of field isn't something that humans can even imagine until photography was invented, right? When you have like an out of focus background or foreground, like that is a photographic effect. And I'm trying to go back before then. So I have to completely eliminate awareness of depth and field if I want it to look painterly, right? So I'm shooting at very small apertures, like f/18, right? f/18, even though it's a bright sunny day, I'm still having to pump up the ISO. So I'm shooting at like ISO 800 at like f/18. And because it's a leaf shutter, medium format camera, I'm able to sync at high speed flash. I've got my flash at full power. So the PhaseOne at ISO 800 is unbelievably high quality.
Yeah.
And this was like the technological advance that was really necessary for these photographs to exist.
Yeah.
And then of course the Profoto lighting being as strong as it is, I went full power the whole time. So that had to be as strong as it was.
And what were your shutter speeds like?
Oh, and that's the other key element, 500th of a second.
Wow.
Because they're moving so fast. So that's it. 500th of a second, f/18, right? How do I get that bright enough, right? By being able to shoot at ISO 800 and with a super, super powerful flash. But Lorraine and Avedon never could have done that.
Right.
Because the technology just didn't exist, right?
Right.
So I'm using these studio lighting techniques. I'm thinking about documentary, not just, of course, Avedon and Gilbert, but I'm thinking about documentary and photojournalism that doesn't use flash, right? That isn't encumbered by issues of lighting. And I'm also thinking of like early influences like Annie Leibovitz, when I was younger, Annie Liebe was one of the most visible photographers. So I was interested in this studio lighting, the way that you can adjust the exposure in your background to the foreground. But now I'm using it in like high speed situations. I'm combining all these ways I learned to see and the techniques that I understood as a student and a practitioner of photography. How could I take all these things and apply them to this particular subject matter, these fast moving tree planters in the wilderness? And so it was like all these different things coming together to create this one extraordinary and hard to achieve effect.
Yeah. Did you do any testing with the equipment? I mean, that's not something that you just go out and buy.
It took me 6 months to prepare the gear
Mhm.
and figure that all out. And when I first went out, I had an old Hasselblad camera that I had bought used. So I took it out with me to the bush, and this was my big master plan. And it actually broke on the first day.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I got one shot off, if you can
Whoa.
believe it. And I'm up in the mountains, and I've driven all the way across Canada. It took me 8 days, and now I have no camera.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And that was the only camera you brought with you?
Well, I knew I only wanted to make a certain kind of picture. So I
Right,
had brought
right.
a Canon 5D Mark IV that I use for all the time lapses and the night skies. But that wasn't going to give me these big heroic images I wanted to make. And so I shot video for the first couple of weeks until I could get a new camera. And the first of the 4 seasons I was out there, I actually used a Canon 50R. So it was a 50 megapixel Canon, and it got me almost what I wanted.
Mm.
But then I came back, and on the strength of those images was able to get a little bit of sponsorship from B3K, which is a camera shop in Toronto that specializes in PhaseOne. And another buddy of mine, Bruce McNeil, was like, Rita, you need a PhaseOne. And I started looking at the PhaseOne, and yeah, it turned out to be the perfect camera. It's only that it cost $50,000.
Yeah.
And B3K made it feasible for me to go in that direction, and it was a game changer. I still love the photos I made that first year. I don't print them quite as big. The PhaseOne prints, they're like 7 feet by 4 feet. The ones from the first year, they're sized down. They're like 54 inches wide. So they can't go as
Right.
majestically big. So gear, right? What can you do?
Yeah.
Talking. But it did force me to get into the video right off the top, because a lot of people assume that I started with the stills.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, in fact, I only shot video for the first 2 weeks because it took that long for the other camera to arrive in the northern town where I was.
Wow.
I had to have it shipped up.
Tell me, like that first year, you go there, your camera breaks, and you're trying to sort of salvage things. What was the response from all the planters that you were with? I mean, were they willing to pose for you or to be part of the project right off the bat?
Well, like even with the big in that I had, it was still a bit of a challenge. I mean, certainly not the hardest challenge I've had in terms of getting access, because it was a community that I had once been a part of, but there's more than 30 years age difference between us. And I had met a young planter before I started the project who had actually just come out and said to me, they're going to just think you're irrelevant. Like no one's going to want you in their camp because you're just irrelevant, right? So they have a big camp meeting at the beginning of every week. And the first camp meeting, the owner of the company, who's an old friend of mine who I used to plant trees with, Garth Hadley. Garth was an old tree planting buddy back from the 80s and 90s. And back in like 1990 or 91 or something, we talked about making a documentary film about tree planting. But of course, we had no idea how to do it. It never happened. And we'd stayed in touch over the years. And we connected. I happened to be in New York exhibiting Afghanistan work, and he was there with his wife, who's a travel agent, and we got together. And I had just come back from shooting in Palestine, and I was really actually done with conflict, and I felt like I needed to get out. I needed to do something more hopeful. And I said, Garth, I think it's time we made that documentary we talked about all those years ago. And he said, well, your timing's perfect because I just bought the company we used to work for, and it's like, okay, there's no time like the present. I almost immediately went out and bought a 4-wheel drive Jeep, which at bare minimum I would need to drive on those logging roads, and started preparing gear with my good friend Scotty Wilson. So Scotty comes on board and I'm getting everything ready. But so when I'm in the camp, Garth owns the company and he was kind of a legendary tree planter. So all he needed to say was, I used to plant with Rita, and already my status kind of rose.
Mm-hmm.
And I would find them in the bush, and it might be like a 3-hour walk up a mountain to find someone. And
Wow.
because they're like, oh, they're over hill and over dale, and you might find them here or there. And so you're hiking and you're hiking and you haven't even found anybody yet, and you're already exhausted.
Jeez.
And I would say to them, you don't need to stop because I'm doing action stuff. Because if they had to slow down, I wouldn't have lasted very long because time is money, right?
Right.
So, they kind of look at me skeptically because the work's really hard and it's especially early season, and they're like grumbling, like, who the hell are you? Like, have you ever planted trees? And I'm like, yeah, for 10 years. And they're like, okay. And I'm like, and I was a war photographer. And they're like, okay, maybe we'll give you a chance. Then they would go back to camp and word would get around. Oh, well, she came and she photographed me and it didn't get in the way. And then I started doing interviews. And I often found them very emotional.
Yeah.
This hard work, it brings out people's emotionality. And I've become very close to some of them, not surprisingly. And I've been asked, what was my biggest takeaway from this mega art trifecta, as you call it?
Yeah.
And the biggest takeaway, without hesitating, is the young people who are now in my life.
Oh, that's great. So I want to go back to the first year when you were shooting with the Canon. And what kind of flash setup did you have then?
So the flash was always the same. Fortunately, I never had any issues with that. I am a huge fan of Profoto lighting. Not only is it the most extraordinary quality of light of any light I've ever used, it's so durable and reliable.
Yeah.
And I just dial it up to 100%, put it in my assistant's hand. It's connected to my camera via radio transmitter, and it's foolproof.
So you always worked with an assistant.
So I needed an assistant to hold the light. So this was like such a luxury, of course. I've used flash my whole career. Usually an off-camera flash connected to a cable to give me a little bit of moving power with it, at least the breadth of my arm. But with this project, I knew that I could up my gear to the highest level because I'm not having to get on an airplane. No one's going to be shooting at me. Okay, yeah, it's challenging terrain, but I could actually do it. I could carry all this stuff in my trailer and my vehicle. And I really was determined with this project to pull out all the stops and just go 100% with everything. I had 4 Profoto B1 lights and the PhaseOne, of course. Because my subjects are moving and because I can't hold the light, an assistant shadowed me 24/7.
The PhaseOne is basically a two-handed camera.
Yeah, the PhaseOne weighs 10 pounds and the Profoto weighs 10 pounds. So my assistant didn't have to know anything about photography, but had to be good on their feet. Super, super fit, strong women who also, as athletes, they had this winning mindset. And the photography stuff, well, I knew that. They had to figure out how to dance with me in the land.
Yeah. How did you work that? Was there some sort of communication that you built up?
There's like a physical communication. And it was kind of like a dance where the tree planters are moving forward. Because I used to be a tree planter, I'm anticipating where they're going, which is not obvious because we're talking green up to your ears, and it's not a farmer's field. I, because of my many years planting, could see where they had been and where they had to go because you're basically filling in land. You cannot overlap. You can't double plant. You have to be between 6 feet and 6 feet 6 inches in completely overgrown terrain. You have to know how to know where they're going. So I have to anticipate where they're going to be next, in front of them and backwards, to the inch, because I want them to fill the frame in a particular way. I spend 2 hours with someone just learning how they move. Do they hook right or do they hook left? So that when I get that moment, I will be able to get that perfect composition. And then everything else has to be perfect too. The light has to be perfect. The background has to be perfect. The foreground has to be perfect. So many things have to come together at once to make it work. So that just meant a huge amount of repetition in this same land. So I say I'm dancing backwards in front of the planters, my assistant is dancing with me and getting that light with the big softbox on it down at the same angle that I'm shooting up at the planters from. And so they're moving with me. I don't even need to speak. Sometimes I'm pointing with my elbows, you know.
Wow. What was your success rate?
There were a couple of planters who I've probably photographed 3 or 4 times over the 4 years, and each time it would have been like 4 hours or something, and I never even managed to get ones that made the final take. And sometimes I would photograph for 3 hours and I would get a shot. Because so many things had to happen.
Line up, yeah.
So days would go by and I would not get what I was looking for. Like I would get, quote, great shots. And, I always tell students or anybody who will listen that making a really good photograph is easy once you've got enough experience. That's what you get hired for, is to make really good photographs all the time, all the time, all the time. Making an extraordinary photograph that takes your breath away, that's almost impossible. It's so, so hard. So those shots were very, very rare.
Yeah. Would you spend any time when you were out in the field chimping?
You know what? I absolutely did. Like I knew when I didn't get it, but when I was getting close, then I would chimp because it was so damn hard to do. I wasn't going to walk back down the mountain unless I was sure.
Right.
To have that certainty that I had it was really important in terms of being able to move on. If I look at it and I knew it was that shot, I would usually start screaming in jubilation, like, oh my God, holy F, yeah, we did it, we effing did it, oh my God, holy F, we nailed it. I would go ballistic because it was so hard. And also because our adrenaline, we're like out there, we're working so, so, so hard. And it's just like failure after failure after failure after failure after failure. And you just keep digging in. And then I would get a shot and everything was coming together. The land was right. The light was right. The pre-planner was on. Everything was working. I was in sync with them. And then I would say to my assistant, so you know what we do when we have the killer shot in the can? And they go, yeah, we work harder. And then we would just push it even harder and see if we could get beyond that. And sometimes we did, or sometimes that was the one.
Wow. Well, I think now is a great time to take a little break. When we come back, we'll have more with Rita Leistner and Canadian tree planters. Stay tuned. I hope you're enjoying this chat with Rita Leistner for my monthly series, Picturing World Cultures. Before we go back to the show, I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, JG Rite 99, who recently called my new series outstanding in their review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for the kind words, JG. We're thrilled to know that you find our show to be worth every minute you spend here. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode and our podcast in general. So please leave a rating and post a review on Apple Podcasts. And stay tuned for my next episode of Picturing World Cultures coming up in May. Okay, we are back with Rita Leistner and her series on Canadian tree planters. And we're going to dive more into a little bit of technical detail and also the relationship of tree planting to Canadian life. So, Rita, one more question about the technical stuff. What about power consumption?
So I found my file. It's called Rita Charger and Batteries List 2019. It's a list of every single battery I had on that project, how many volts it was, how many amps it was. And from that, I would figure out how many watts it took. And I had a Honda generator of my own because you don't want to be invasive any more than you already are. And I researched solar power, and there's just not enough sun unless maybe you're in the desert. It wasn't going to be feasible. So I went for a Honda 2000 watt generator, and therefore I needed an awful lot of fuel, but I needed that anyway. So I always brought in an extra, honestly, 15 giant jerry cans full of fuel because I'd go in, I'd need extra fuel for my Jeep and I'd need fuel for my generator. And I needed a lot of chargers, but I actually was kind of conservative. So my generator could technically draw 2000 watts at a time, but I had it around 1750 because during the day you can't charge, right? Like you're out in the field, and
right?
So much effort to be out there. You don't want your drone to run out of batteries. So I had 6 batteries for my drone alone. And I had just a ton of batteries for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to have a lot of chargers too, because it's not like I'm in a hotel and I can be serial charging batteries all night or all day. I don't get back to camp till maybe 7 p.m. or so. And I hope to be asleep by 11. So that doesn't give me a lot of time for charging. The slowest charge was the batteries for my Sony A7S II. Those took 4 hours. So I had a minimum of 4 hours of charging because I had this big charging station. I'd get back, I'd start up the generator, get all the batteries. My assistant helped me with this, right? That's what they would do. I would start downloading files. I would start downloading onto my 15-inch MacBook Pro, just having a quick look, making sure everything's okay. Then everything's backed up 3 times. So it's on my computer and it's on 2 other drives. One of the drives lives in my Jeep. There's always the quote offsite drive in my Jeep. So, trying to get enough sleep, that was a really big deal.
And what time do you start in the morning?
Oh, and then up at 5.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm asleep by 11, I'm up at 5, I'm getting 6 hours sleep. That's what I'm hoping for. So get everything charged and then put it all back. Everything goes back in all the gears. Everything's ready. Clean everything, blah, 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 blah. And it's so dirty out there, right? So clean, put it all back in the proper cases. Everything's got to be where it's got to be. And it gets loaded back in the Jeep. So at 5 o'clock in the morning, when I get up, I do a last check of everything, drink some coffee, and off we go.
Wow. Man. So, talk a little bit about the conditions, the dirt, the inclement weather, the bugs.
So the worst weather for shooting was definitely rain. I had a ton of Manfrotto brand rain covers for everything, but they slow you down for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't necessarily what I was looking for in most of my shots. So for the portraits, I wouldn't shoot if it was raining, but then there's a lot of other video stuff I really wanted to try and get in the rain, definitely.
Right.
So for production, rain is the worst because it's really hard to keep gear dry and you want to get shots of rain. It's hard to do. That was the hardest technically with all the bugs, which were heinous, and the cold could be so debilitating and horrible because imagine it's snowing. You're wet and you're on the top of a mountain and it's started to snow and you're out there. You don't really have anywhere warm to go, but at least you could still shoot with the bugs. And I remember the first day I was shooting, the bugs were really, really, really unbelievably bad. I'm used to it. So I'd wear a lot of bug repellent and I could shoot. I could stand there and some people might go insane, but I can handle that stuff. Doesn't mean I like it, but I remembered thinking oh, great, because I need this footage. You're a photographer, you're thinking, oh, this is great because it's the footage I need, even though it's terrible.
With the film, you would take a lot of video in conditions when you wouldn't take portraits.
Yeah.
Were you keeping a log of what you were filming so to be able to conceptualize what you wanted to do for the final film?
Yeah, I definitely had categories that I was covering. Absolutely. The same as I would do when I was doing documentary photography project, right? You make lists of things that you want to get. Anywhere from flowers to snow to rain. Of course, the action portraits, the visual things you want to get, people working in camp, tents, what people sleep in. Hands is a big one, right? I wanted to do a series of hands. So yeah, I definitely had a long, long list and it really took me the 4 years to get through it. In the beginning, I thought this will take me 2 years. And then at the end of the 3rd year, I felt like I needed to be done. They even threw me a goodbye party. And on my way driving out of camp, I turned to my friend Liam Maloney, who had come out to help me with some of the video shooting. And I said, oh, I have to come back another year. Because the list wasn't complete. What I needed then was more of the night forest stuff.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That footage is just so magical. How on earth did you get such beautiful lighting and drama in the middle of the dead forest?
Thank you so much. I mean, that also was something that took a while to figure out. I knew it wouldn't be the first thing I photographed. And also the first 2 years, I was focusing on those portraits because they were so physically grueling and rare, and to feel kind of safe that the project was under control, I needed to get those. And then Stephen Bulger had also offered me an exhibition at the end of the second year. So I wanted to make sure I had enough portraits for a full exhibition. And then once those were in the can, I could kind of breathe and I could turn to the night forest and how I was going to execute that. Because as difficult as the night forests were to get, once everything was in place, it was doable. It wasn't like the portraits where I didn't know if I was going to get it. I knew that if I did everything right, the way I had planned for the night photography, it would be possible, other than, we needed clear skies, which was not at all obvious up in the mountains in the spring and summer. Because I wanted the stars to be a part of the images. So it was only if there was an absolute clear sky that would even be a go. I'd been thinking about photographing night forests since I was a teenager. I mean, when I was a tree planter, the takeaways were, of course, an unbelievable physical brutality of the work that I really wanted to show. And that's what the portraits were about.
Yeah.
And then the other was living on the perimeters of these forests. They're not like deep world forests. They're peripheral forests because you're always near a cut block if you're planting trees, right? Like there's no need for a tree planter in a dense forest. You have to be somewhere where forest has been taken away. So you're always on these kinds of margins. I also like that metaphorically. But on days off, or sometimes just in the middle of the day, maybe you were so sick of working, you needed to take a break, and you might, on a rare occasion, like walk through the forest because you'd seen on an aerial photograph that there was a little lake nearby. You'd flag your way. You'd use like color flag because you could so easily get lost. And so I had all these memories of being in the forest, and especially at night on days off, like being young and looking up at these unbelievable, unbelievable night skies through the cathedral of trees up above. And I always wondered, would there be a way of evoking that feeling, because that's photography is a feeling. How do you photograph a feeling, right? It's not easy. So that's how I came up with the idea, looking for this feeling, thinking about time lapse. I wanted to take photographs too, of course. So I brought out the PhaseOne and I had 4 Profoto board lights. That's a lot of light to be dragging into the forest. I needed assistance for that. We're shooting with the Profoto for the stills and then using the Canon for the time lapse. So we're doing this stuff simultaneously, and I'm firing off a lot of strobes because I really want the treetops to be bright, and one strobe isn't enough, right? But of course, if your shutter's open, fire that strobe off multiple times, right? So a lot of multiple strobes, and that is showing up in the time lapse footage, which I wanted to, because I wanted there to be a connection between these things, and I wanted the time lapse footage, which of course plays as film, to refer to the photography. I like photography that refers to itself. I'm not like hiding behind an idea. I'm interested in the action of the artist on the landscape or the subject matter and the action of the photography as well. My friend Don McKellar said to me, "Oh, that's interesting because it's a parallel between man's action on the land in logging and what we're doing to damage the environment, but like man's intervention in the land. And then I am also, as an artist, I'm now like intervening in it in another way." So there are these like artistic interventions on the subject matter, of which, of course, the lighting is always so essential to all of it. I mean, what are you going to do in a forest in pitch black at night? You could do a long exposure. That's pretty much the only thing you could do. But what I'm doing is I'm combining all these things, long exposures with strobe.
And animating the space.
And trying to create that feeling that I'd had so many years ago when I was young in the forest. And I feel like I actually managed.
Yeah. Oh, my God. It's one of the most incredible highlights of the film.
Oh, thanks.
It's really beautiful. So on that note of the in-between loggers and the environmentalists, you once described planters as stuck between being seen as interlopers by the logging communities and environmentalist perception as cogs in the wheel of the logging industry. Can you elaborate on that dynamic and what it does to the minds of the planters or their outlook?
Tree planters are easy targets. And undoubtedly, they work in the logging industry, and it's a money-making venture. They're not volunteers. No one would do this as a
Right.
volunteer. As you know, it's not going out for a couple of hours on a nice day, planting a couple of trees, and then having a picnic. Like, it's brutal physical work. And, as I said earlier on, logging is hundreds of years old. Tree planting is brand new. Foresters tell me all the time, and I know lots of foresters and environmentalists, of course, and they remind me that it's a slow science. Like, if you change reforestation practices, you don't know the next day whether it's worked or not, because trees take a long time to grow. Like in northern Canada, where we're planting, like these trees take 80 years to grow to full height. They might be logged a little bit sooner than that. They're conifers, they're spruce and pine for the most part. They're indigenous to the area, a little bit of science on conifer trees. They don't have deep roots. When you're somewhere where the ground freezes, roots are
Right.
not going down super, super deep. So there's only certain kind of trees that grow in these areas. And these aren't like giant redwoods that live till they're thousands of years old. These are trees that generally live about 80 years before they fall over. So they're planting indigenous trees. They're trying to plant trees that will grow quickly, of course, because they're slated for being logged at some time in the future, long after I'm dead, for sure. There are a lot of problematic processes that have taken place in the logging industry and continue. But on the other hand, there are regulations. No one cuts a tree in Canada, and probably not in the US either, without having a government permit to do it.
Huh.
Not like in, say, Brazil or Cambodia or places where there's all kinds of illegal logging. Like,
Right.
there's lots of illegal logging. So maybe in Canada, trees are being cut that we don't want to see cut. Like, there are old growth forests. Don't touch them. But if they're being cut, the government is okaying it. And so it always comes back to policy and the people, and the pressure has to be put on the government. And for that to happen, there has to be a wider understanding in society about the realities of what's going on and consumption. That's what we need to look at. So there's this really big story about the problems of reforestation and of logging. I mean, most recently with all the fires going on, right? Like,
Yeah.
really heartbreaking to see newly planted areas go up in smoke. There was a piece in the New York Times in particular. So the New York Times has this big story about how tree planters are to blame for all the forest fires. It's like, no, global warming actually is to blame for the forest fires. And in fact, the forestry industry, there's more blame in fire suppression because they've put a lot of effort into fire suppression. And fires happen in forests. It's a part of how they work. And so if you suppress too many fires, then suddenly you're not controlling it as much. Like, indigenous knowledge is very big on how controlled burning helps
Right.
prevent uncontrolled burning. And so some of these fires, what happen is that they don't cut enough in the right way. People don't want to hear that, right? So it's not popular to say, oh, well, they didn't cut enough, because this is happening in these certain areas. You have to leave empty areas, because the empty areas, the fire can't leap across, right?
Yeah.
It's super complicated. And I think a lot of tree planters have self-loathing over their engagement in this industry. But there is no alternative to not plant trees.
Right.
It's still good that we plant trees. And it is through this that we learn and we become more aware of what's going on in the forest. And, tree planting, it changes people. I always talk about tree planters as being witnesses to the land, because who knows what a clear cut looks like better than a tree planter. Back when I was planting, and there wasn't a lot of aerial photography and Google Maps, people didn't really know what was going on the landscape. So it was the tree planters who were going in on foot, seeing what was happening with the clear cutting. And those tree planters then, they leave planting and they go out back into society, and they take that learned knowledge and they do something with it. Tree planters become environmentalists, or they become foresters, or they become politicians. I mean, one of our members of parliament in Vancouver. Joyce Murray was one of the founders of one of the first tree planting companies in Canada, Brinkman Reforestation. She's very active in all things to do with forestry and forest preservation. Or me, like artist who dedicates 10 years of her life almost to this subject. So
Right.
it can also move you to action, you know?
Yes.
But there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, there's never a finish line.
There's no finish line. There's no finish line. No.
You've referred to your work photographing the young tree planters as a second coming of age. What did you learn about the younger generation of tree planters during the time you spent with them?
Well, when I went back, I was at a transitional point in my life, and I had been teaching at the University of Toronto part-time, and then the rest of the year I was going overseas working on projects, a lot in conflict zones, and I was just feeling really depressed, and I was feeling hopeless. But at the same time, I looked at these young people, and I stopped teaching because I thought, I don't feel that I can impart hope to them. And that's messed up, because like, who am I at my age to have no hope? Like, I have no right to have no hope because I'm already older. And I remembered how much tree planting had given me and how it had been a coming of age experience for me. And I wondered if it was what I had remembered it as, or if maybe I had just romanticized it over the years, and what would happen if I went back and I actually did try to make this project. Would it be as I remembered? And so I went back, and I really quickly did see that it did have what it had given me. It was the community and the clarity of purpose, despite the lack of environmental simplicity of tree planting, which was always there. It's always been part of a process and an industry to just go out in the land and work with your body like that in the land and breathe clean air and have like a really simple purpose, like plant one more tree, one tree at a time. You do that for 10 years and you plant a forest. That metaphor of how things happen is so powerful. And I think it gives something to the planters. It gave me something. It continues to give me something. I was really touched by how wise they were. Not all the time, of course, nor am I. But like the young assistants who worked for me, there were so many days where I felt despairing because it was so hard. And when you're that tired, it makes you way more emotional. And they would buoy me up. These 20-year-old women would buoy me up with their wisdom and their ability to persevere. And you kind of realize that these character traits that you have, like you have them your whole life, like you apply them to different circumstances. But what kept you going when you were 20 is kind of the same thing that keeps you going when you're 60 or when you're 80. Like when I started showing interviews to my 80-year-old mom, and she was like, wow, this is really profound. This is really helpful. I could totally relate. I knew I was onto something. That was the first year. I said, I know this is something. This is not just a movie about planting trees.
Right. And you reminiscing over what the experience was like.
Yeah. And using them in a way as avatars for my own life experience and things that were important to me, because I wasn't documented when I was a tree planter. I mean, no one had made a film about tree planting this emotional before. Like there were like more sort of technical films, but like something, this full feature length film. And I wanted to tell my own story. So I was telling my own story as a tree planter, but also as a 60-year-old woman who had lived through war zones and lived through addiction and recovery, which is another huge, huge theme in the film and a story I wanted to tell. I found that the canvas of tree planting was rich enough to enable me to tell these layers of stories, the recovery of the land and the environment, the recovery of conflict and war, this personal recovery from addiction and other kinds of self-abuse. And then, of course, the connection of all these things to each other.
Yeah. Has it changed the way you feel about your Canadian heritage or your Canadian identity?
Well, anyone who lives in Canada and has had the time and the chance to drive out of the cities, which is most people, it's one of the first things they'll try and do. And the first time you get in a car and you drive north, the further north you go, the further you get from cities and people, and the closer you get to the land. I mean, there's a lot of land in Canada.
Yeah.
And that's a really big part of anyone's identity living here. You know, like where I live right now, I'm looking over Lake Ontario and I can see New York State on the other side of the lake. But this is an extraordinary large body of water, you know? And I know that directly north in the other direction, it's rock, it's Canadian Shield. This vastness of the land, it lets you breathe in a different way. So tree planting is part of that. And I think it's Canadian in that way. You know, when we're planting, we talk about being in the land, you know, like I was out in the land, not on it. You're in it.
Yeah.
You know, I decided with this project, I was going to make an emotional film, not a technical scientific film. And I've always felt this way as a social documentarian and photojournalist. I appeal to the emotion. So if my film can make people feel something, that's my forte, rather than teaching them something about the science or the environmentalism. And if it leads them to learning more, then that's a good thing. But my job was to make people feel.
Well, the feelings are the source where it all comes from.
Yeah.
I think that's a great spot to end on. So thanks so much, Rita, for sharing these stories about Canadian tree planters with us and for your experience documenting this fascinating subculture. But before we go, I'd like to end with a short visual questionnaire inspired by the TV show Inside the Actor's Studio. It's a brief list of questions with one-sentence answers. So Rita Leistner, with all things being equal, what's your preference, black and white or color?
I love this questionnaire. It's so hard. So up until the pandemic, I definitely would have called myself a color photographer. I mean, that's what I'm known for, is color. I'm so grateful that I see the world in color. Color is so crucial. Also extremely hard to do well. During the pandemic, everything changed, and I have not been able to shoot in color since the pandemic. I'm just shooting in black and white, and I'm making charcoal drawings. Portraits, actually. I'm drawing portraits in charcoal and pencil. Cool. So I went from color to black and white during the pandemic, and I don't know when or if that will change.
Man, that's transformation.
Yeah.
So which image orientation do you gravitate more often?
Horizontal, definitely.
And generally speaking, what's your camera preference? Is it the PhaseOne, or do you usually gravitate to something else?
Well, we talked about this earlier. I'm always looking for the gear for the project, not the other way around. But definitely since the tree planting project ended, it's been my Canon 5D Mark IV. I could use it, without having to think much about it. I don't need to reread the manual. I love it.
And what about lenses? Do you prefer primes or zooms?
35 mil. If I had to have one lens, it would be a 35 millimeter prime.
Okay. And what's the most important thing you look for at the instance when you click the shutter?
Well, this is maybe a cheating answer, but really it's a simultaneity of events. I guess beginning with content, then composition, then light. I put light last because light is the thing I have the most control over. Well, composition too, I can move myself, right? But the content's got to be there. And then the composition has to be possible, which means I have to have physical access to it. And then light, either the light that's on it or the light that I bring to it. But it all has to be there or it's nothing. It's like it's everything or nothing. Right?
Yeah. So what one photographer, living or dead, has influenced your work the most?
Does anyone actually answer this in one?
Oh, some people have stretched it to two.
Okay. It's a toss-up between Philip Jones Griffith and Nan Golden.
Oh, wow. Now that covers a lot of ground.
Yeah. And well,
I was thinking you were going to refer back to the woman who inspired the tree planters.
Well, I mean, she's important, but thinking about that, there are so many photographers who have influenced me.
Right.
And Philip Jones Griffiths has influenced so many of the photographers who have influenced me, as
Right.
well as Nan Golden. And so by citing them, I'm also citing their legacies.
Yeah. 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 And that covers a lot of ground.
And then I would also say Annie Leibovitz and Ouija.
Wow.
And so if you get all of those together, then I think that's kind of what I'm
That's
going
you.
for.
Other than photography, what profession or craft would you most like to explore?
Well, right now I'm exploring drawing portraits in pencil and charcoal.
Mhm.
So it's kind of funny because I'm a portrait photographer, but now when people are like, oh, I'm not thinking about taking people's portraits, I'm thinking about drawing them. So right now, that's kind of where I'm going. I like that there's no gear.
Yeah.
And not so seriously, but I think in another life I could have been a fashion designer or interior designer.
Cool. Finally, in a single word, what is your biggest motivation for making pictures?
To go back to the last thing we were talking about at the end of our long interview, connection and feeling.
Yeah. That's a great response.
I want to feel, I just want to feel.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all do, right?
Yeah.
Even the bad. Like, I love the idea that feelings are all kind of equal in a sense, like good and bad, just to look at them as a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're going to have them all.
Very Buddhist.
Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly.
So are there projects you're currently working on, or is the tree planters work going to be shown anywhere coming up?
Well, my film is screening on April 22nd, which is Earth Day at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies in Banff, Alberta, which I'm really happy about because I love Banff. And, Banff has a big cultural center there, the Banff Center for the Arts, which awarded my book a wonderful prize. And they took me out there last year, and then I was invited to come back to the White Museum. So that'll be really fun. And what else? There's a little interview coming out in Photo Ed magazine, which is a really great Canadian photo education magazine. But the people running it are really smart and really dedicated to photography. And they did an interview about my pandemic work with me. So that's coming out. But, to go back to what I was saying earlier too, I'm just kind of tired, I'm still unpacking boxes. I just feel like I haven't had a break in so long, and I'm about to turn 60. And I don't know, like I'm kind of spent right now.
Well, you deserve a little time for rest and reflection.
I need to be okay with that because I've never really quite felt this way before. So
yeah,
thanks for saying I deserve it. I think it was coming,
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. I don't know. I hope the next thing finds me.
It will, I'm sure.
So I really appreciate doing this. This is really great. I was so happy to receive your invitation.
Yeah.
And of course, some of my gear was bought at B&H because some stuff like you just can't find it up here. And B&H ships really reliably to Toronto and to British Columbia.
That's great. So where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I think my website's probably the most comprehensive place, and that's just ritaleistner.com.
Okay.
There's a website for my film, Forest for the Trees documentary.com, and that's also got a link of where you can buy the book, which is distributed in the US. You can get it in the US, you can get it anywhere, but there's a distributor right in the US.
Social media?
Instagram page that's not very active these days. Actually, when my dad got sick, I just stopped posting. So maybe I'll get back to that one day. But I'm unpacking my photo books right now after them being in boxes and in storage for 9 months. It really coincided nicely with talking with you. But I realize how much photo books mean to me.
Yeah, there's a whole new world of inspiration for you to dig into.
Yeah, it's really an important genre for photography, as we know.
Yeah. So, Rita Leistner, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this show, we'd love to hear about it. Pull up this episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure that subscribe button is clicked for automatic updates about every episode release. While you're there, please leave us a comment. We're waiting for your feedback. You can also find us and drop us a line on the Explora blog, where we post photos from our guests along with show notes. And if you're a fan of social media, please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast Group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast creative producer and host of this series. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Theme music for this series was composed by Gabriel Richards. Our executive producer is Bjorn Peterson, and our editorial director is Sean Steiner. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for joining us for this series.